of Columbia University.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here again, and it's a particular pleasure to be able to talk about this topic. I know you're focused a great deal about the problem of inequality in Korea, and your new government has really made this a subject of its concern. We've heard a couple of congratulatory messages about being at $30,000 per capita income isn't enough. There has to be shared prosperity. What I want to do this morning is to talk first about some very general principles. The problems facing Korea today are similar to the problems facing many other advanced countries. In fact, in many ways, Korea's problems are not in any way as severe as those in the United States. But to me, the biggest difference between what is going on in Korea and what is going on in the United States is that Korea is committed to promoting economic growth, but at the same time promoting shared prosperity to make sure that the problem of inequality is dealt with. For us Americans, the problem is that we have a president, a government, that is actually increasing inequality and is going in the wrong direction. So I sometimes emphasize to my students that it's good to study what's going on in America because you see what not to do. It's a lesson in, you might say, failure. But if you look around the world, there are many experiments going on with different kinds of economic and social systems. And some are working much better than others. There are some that have created more equality and maintained economic growth. They've achieved this goal of shared prosperity. So I think it's a good thing for Korea to look around at the failures, say in America, and the successes, particularly say in the Nordic countries, and ask, what are the lessons to be learned? Are there things that Korea can take out from the countries that are more successful and apply them to Korea? So as I say, most of my talk is going to be about the basic principles, the general ideas, and then I'll spend a little time at the end talking about some of the relevance of these, particularly to Korea. So to begin with, in terms of, you might say, the first principles, the first is the objective of the economy is to increase well-being. We just heard a discussion from the mayor about this. Per capita income by itself is not a good measure of well-being. And this is, I think, a fundamental lesson. The market economy is a means to an end, not an end in itself. I did a report for the French government originally, but an international commission in which Angus Deaton also served, on the idea that GDP does not really encompass a good measure of societal well-being, and that one has to broaden out one's perspective. And in particular, it doesn't talk about sustainability, and it doesn't talk about how the fruits of the growth are shared. So you could have a GDP going up because a few people at the top are doing well, and yet most are not. And I'll show you a figure that is exactly what is happening in the United States. What we've learned is that the market economy that is wrongly structured fails. It fails in growth, but even more, it fails to achieve shared prosperity. But we have to understand that markets don't exist in a vacuum. Sometimes in textbooks you say the market economy, but there are many, many different kinds of market economies. Market economies have to be structured, there have to be rules, and the problem that the world is facing is that beginning around 1980 with Ronald Reagan and Thatcher in the UK, markets were restructured in ways that actually led to slower growth. Growth slowed down again after these neoliberal reforms, and at the same time, inequality increased. And so one of the things I've been emphasizing is that we now need to rewrite the rules of the market economy in ways that can make it grow faster and in which there's shared prosperity. And these battles over the rules, like the battles over regulation going on in the United States, are really the key battles facing our societies. This graph shows what has happened in the United States, but it's illustrative. There are similar graphs, not quite so dramatic, in other countries in Europe. What you see there is, on the line going up, is the average income of the top 1%. And what you see going back, way back to 1973, that they've been doing very, very well. The dark line at the bottom is not the horizontal axis. It looks like the horizontal axis because it's almost there. And I didn't play any games with the axes here. These are just natural numbers. That line that looks almost flat is the average income of the bottom 90% of America. And what you see is that there's been no growth. This is an economy that's not performing for the vast majority of the citizens. It's not just the poor we're talking about the bottom 90%. If you have a microscope, you can see something going on, but you need a microscope in order to see that there's been any progress. Worse in some ways is the fact that American capitalism has been changing who we are. The standard economic textbooks always begins with the notion that people are born with their preferences, their utility functions as this way are given. We all know that's not true. We work very hard to make sure that our children are concerned with others, that they behave well. So we actually know that you shape people. But our economy is shaping us. Our economy is shaping us in ways that are making us more selfish, more materialistic. There's an unprecedented level of moral turpitude exhibited by those in the financial sector, preying on those at the bottom. And this kind of dishonesty is spreading out of the financial sector, spreading out of America all over the world. And you see it, for instance, in the dishonesty exhibited in the scandal in VW, where they hid the magnitude of the pollution that their cars were doing. And it wasn't just VW, but it was other companies as well. There's a large body of research now in behavioral economics which confirms these impressions. These are just not impressions. You can show the way in which our economy is shaping us to make us more selfish and more materialistic. Well, that brings us to the key question: what is the basis of our growth? If it's not the kind of economic model that was featured by Reagan and Thatcher and the supply side economics, what is the source of economic progress? And to me, it's not based on the exploitation of others. That can lead to wealthy individuals that take money from others. We call it rent-seeking. But it's based on improvements in productivity and what I call creating a learning society. The effect of creating this learning society of knowledge is that we change the stagnation that had plagued the world until around 1750. In a way, Adam Smith, who is often characterized as the father of modern economics, could not have appreciated this because he was beginning just at the period of the modern innovation economy, partly because of the insights of the Enlightenment, of which he was a very important part. And we see this now in some of this data. These are a graph of historical living standards. The data going back, 1,000 years, and what you see is almost no change in living standards for century after century. You can see a little bit of what happens. This is another data, basically the real wages of London craftsmen. The British love to gather data. They keep data on wages, on prices, and these are what historians work enormously hard to gather the real wages over a very long period of time. And you see almost nothing going on. You see the kind of things you would have predicted, the Black Plague, which resulted in a shortage of labor. It did lead to an increase in real wage, but very small. Nothing was really changing until around 1750 or 1800, a little bit after that. And then you see this sharp increase. And the same thing true about longevity. Life expectancy had been low. People were living in very miserable lives, short and brutish, as one of the famous writers described it. And then beginning in 1820 in Europe and then in the rest of the world, you saw this dramatic increase in life expectancy. One of the stark things of what is happening now in America that was brought out by the work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton that you're going to hear about in a little is that life expectancy in the United States is now in decline. And this is a dramatic manifestation that things are not going well. Well, when I think about what happened, how do we account for these dramatic changes in standards of living, in life expectancy? To me, the critical role is that of the Enlightenment. The idea that change was possible, that authority wasn't given from God, that it was man. And there are two important parts of this. One is the development of science, and the other is the development of an understanding of social organization, how we work together, how we cooperate. And that nature of our social organization, which was not to be dictated by an outside authority, by a king, we had to think about it ourselves, led to the notion of the rule of law. And there's many subtleties of what that means, and that is a critical question that needs to be discussed. But arriving at what is a good form of a social organization had to be based on reasoned discourse, on deliberation. Part of the reason is that you couldn't really engage in controlled experiments. You had to employ thought experiments, looking at what is happening, as you are doing in the most successful countries and in those that failed. And in that way, through social science, advancing our understanding of social interactions. So as we think about what we have learned about these principles of good social organization that can be the basis of progress, of shared progress, there are a couple of ideas that come into play. One is the importance of coordination and the need for regulation. There's been a massive attack against regulation in the United States. But if you think about it, think about our cities. What would our cities be like without stoplights? We would have gridlock. Stoplights are a simple method of regulation of who crosses the street first. And unique stoplights, a simple form of organization, a coordination that really enables us to function together as a society. And there are massive, what we call social externalities, where one person's actions affect another. One person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. The freedom to have guns, which the United States has taken to an extreme, means that people are being killed. That's a kind of loss of freedom on the part of those who are being killed. So we have to understand, we have to always balance these, and in the United States, we lost that balance. We always need some form of regulation. There are inherent limitations of markets where private and social interests often are not well aligned. In fact, we know about that in the case of pollution. And if it were not for regulations, our cities would not be breathable. They would not be livable. And finally, we've learned of the necessity of collective action. The most important, of course, is setting the rules of the game. And when you do that wrong, you get bad outcomes. But there are many areas where markets won't suffice. Things like public goods, including the provision of basic research, supporting innovation, including for ordinary citizens. And the final thing I want to emphasize about what we've learned about social organization is the dangers of inequality. And this is a major change in our understanding. It used to be thought that if you wanted more equality, you'd have to give up on economic growth because you'd have to tax, and the taxes would undermine economic efficiency. But now the evidence is fairly clear that excessive inequality, and there is excessive inequality in the United States, and there is excessive inequality in Korea, excessive inequality weakens the economy. And there are many reasons for this that I talk about in my book, The Price of Inequality. Large fractions of the population are not able to live up to their potential. You need a lot of public investments, as I mentioned before, and you can't get support for those. Their most important effect going on right now is that market power, too much power for corporations, too little power for workers, results in economic inefficiencies. And unfortunately, this is getting worse. And finally, in economies in which there's been insufficient aggregate demand, and that's been true in most of the world in the decade after the great financial crisis, when you have more inequality, there is less aggregate demand because those at the bottom consume less than those at the top. The final thing I want to mention in terms of what we've learned from the Enlightenment about good social organization is the importance of democracy. And too much inequality divides society and undermines democracy. Democracy was an important part of what makes a society work. But economic power gives rise to political power. And that results in rewriting the rules of the economic and political game to favor the rich. And so what we're doing in the United States, where there is obviously too much influence of money in politics, and it's true in other countries, we're moving from a system of one person, one vote, to a system that I describe as more close to $1, one vote. So democracy was part of the Enlightenment project. It was a particular form of organization necessary for collective action, and it can be easily corrupted by money. And what we are doing now is moving to an equilibrium where we have too much inequality. They're setting the rules of the game, political game and the economic game, to advantage themselves. And it's a self-perpetuating thing. We are in a bad equilibrium. Other societies, like Norway, are in a good equilibrium. They manage to have low inequality. They pass rules that preserve their egalitarian society, and they've managed to have high economic growth. The dangers of undermining democracy are particularly evident in the United States, where it's given rise to populism, demagoguery, and many people looking at the United States and say, what's happened? But actually, to me, it's very understandable. The economic and our social system has failed large fractions of the population. I showed that graph before where incomes were stagnant. If you look at those who are not college graduates, who are just economics, who just have a high school education, their incomes are actually going down very dramatically. And what's happened is the myths that help define who we are have been undermined. One of these important myths was the American dream. Everybody knows about it, that anybody could go from the bottom to the top. But we now know that that is a myth. It's not true. The statistics show otherwise. If you're born at the top, you stay at the top. If you're born at the bottom, you basically stay at the bottom. As I tell my students, the most important decision you can make in life is choosing the right parent. And if you miss that, your life prospects are over. So actually, among the advanced countries, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced countries. And that means the American model has failed. I talk mostly about economics, but I also want to mention social justice, because we are more than just economic people. We believe in social justice. And what we've learned is that, every morning young Americans say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And there's a phrase, and justice for all. That also is a myth. We have justice for rich white Americans. There are wrongful convictions, even for murder, mass incarceration of especially African Americans. There are no system of justice in disputes with large corporations where there's private arbitration, and the Supreme Court basically has said you can't appeal on private arbitration. They've just taken another step in increasing the power of the corporations just in the last couple of weeks. In our economic crisis, people were thrown out of their homes who did not owe money. Now, one of the reasons why there's such growth of populism is that the stories that were told by the elites, stories about how globalization, liberalization would benefit all, things didn't turn out as they said they would. The elites were excessively confident, and they were closed to open discussion. And it was, and it seemed to be self-serving. They benefited from these policies. And so that has given rise, I think, to a lot of skepticism and cynicism, and that has, I think, fed what might be called the Trump phenomenon. The underlying problem facing the United States and most other advanced countries is that we're going through multiple transformations, from a manufacturing to a service sector economy, from export-led growth to domestic demand. We're going through a demographic transition, an urbanization transition. We're becoming an innovation economy. And the fundamental thing is that markets on their own don't make such transformations well. We know that from history. The Great Depression can be viewed as part of the failure of the transition from agriculture to manufacturing. And this failure can easily be explained in terms of the general theory of market failures. This failure, the transition, the failure of the promises of the elite, I think has given rise to the backlash. Now, it wasn't obvious the form in which the backlash would take. That, I think, is something that I found I can't really explain, but it has taken this particular form in country after country. So there seems to be a pattern here. The form that the backlash has taken is to go against the basic values that have led to what progress we've had. There's been a backlash against education, against the Enlightenment values, against reasoned discourse. They are blamed for the problems. The magnitude of this backlash is hard to really fathom if you're not in the United States. For instance, the Trump administration says that we should be investing less in universities and education. For the first time ever, a tax has been imposed on some of our best universities like Harvard and Princeton. Can you imagine? Most countries subsidize the universities because they know how important they are to our progress. The Trump administration has taxed these universities, and they're trying to undo all the progress that we've made. One of my friends put it, the Enlightenment has to be relitigated every day. There's an attack on our most fundamental values of tolerance, our understandings of progress. there's even an attack on science. Trump proposed a 30% cut in the science budget, and they say they don't believe in climate change, when the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. So to me, these demagogues represent an existential threat to our economic and political system, to democracy and progress. And it's one of the reasons why the problem of inequality has to be addressed. And it's urgent, because delay could lead to these political consequences that you see in the United States and even in Western Europe. It represents a threat to the Enlightenment project, which has underlaid advances in our economy in the past 200 years. The ideas that they proposed are not even based on good market economics. Most of the people in the administration who have, quote, a business background are not real innovators. They are what I've called rent seekers. The difference is whether you make your money by exploiting others, taking a bigger share of the national pie, or making the national pie bigger. The innovators make the national pie bigger. The rent seekers, the exploiters, take away from others. And that distinction is not understood by those in the administration, and that's why they're undermining the basis of creating a bigger economic pie. The key here is the important role of what I call our truth-telling institutions. There is something called truth. We don't know things ever for sure perfectly, but we know some things better than others. And social organization can't function without some way of assessing the truth, of completing claims about due process, of whether you've been treated fairly. And we have actually multiple and complementary truth-telling institutions: universities, judiciary, administrative bureaucracy, intelligence agency. I want to emphasize the important role of the media, partly because they're our hosts, but partly because they really are an important part of our systems of checks and balances. And they played that role very forcefully. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. But there's been an unprecedented attack against these institutions. And if that were successful, it would totally destroy the way we as a society function. So these are the bases of the true progress, economic, social progress of our society. And so in a sense, the real danger of these demagogues is the threat to what I call our epistemology, the way we learn, and the rule of law, the premises on which our economy rests. And one can understand that in terms of, you might call modern behavioral economics, behavioral marketing. If one can sow doubt about whether cigarettes cause cancer and have adverse effects, which we know they do, and the cigarette companies have the evidence in their pocket that they did, and yet they were successful in sowing doubt about whether cigarettes cause cancer. The result of that is many people continue to smoke, and there have been millions of deaths as a result of that. So if you can sell bad products like cigarettes, you can sell bad ideas. And that is at the root of the problems that we are facing today. The damage can be long-lasting, and we are just beginning to see the corrosive effects. So that brings us to the remedies, and most of the rest of my talk is going to be what do we do about it? I don't think it's inherent in the capitalist system, but if we don't get our politics right, it will be. We need to rewrite the rules of the economy and of our democracy. We need to rethink the balance between expertise, independent agencies, and parliamentary processes. Clearly, we need to reinforce our systems of checks and balances, preventing the abuse of power, which we see could so easily come, as we've seen in the United States and many other countries. And we have to understand the sources of inequality and address each. Now, this conference is focusing on inequality, and so I want to give a very brief taxonomy of the sources of inequality. Inequalities in market income, and then there are inequalities in what we do with market income in terms of after-tax and transfer income. So I've been concerned that we have an economic system that has produced too much inequality of market income. Greater inequalities in the ownership of assets, including human capital. We have a system that perpetuates inequalities in human capital, but we also have large inequalities in returns to assets, with those owning assets that are more unequally distributed, like capital, getting a larger and larger share of the national pie. So I've emphasized the importance of pre-distribution, of trying to make sure the market income is more equal. Some societies have really failed. Germany has a very high level of inequality in market income. But what they've done is take that high level of market inequality but reduce it by after-tax redistribution. I think a better system is to try to lower market inequalities. And that's what some of the Nordic countries have succeeded in doing, and that's where rewriting the rules becomes very important. That's where power becomes very important. What has happened in Germany and many other countries is undermining the power of workers and allowing corporations, large corporations, to have too much power. And that leads to too much inequality in market income. So those are the two pieces. My time is running out, so let me just reiterate that what has happened is that globalization, labor legislation, changes in the structure of the economy, financialization, changing the rules of the game, have all led to an increase in market inequality without any benefits. In fact, hurting the overall performance of the economy. And you can see this very dramatically in this chart for the United States, and there's similar charts for Europe, not quite so dramatic, where productivity has increased a little slower rate after the late 70s than before, but it's continued to increase. But the dramatic change is the lower curve, the light blue curve, is what's happened to compensation. What you notice is that before the mid-70s, 1980, compensation and productivity moved together. When the economy got more productive, it was shared. There was shared prosperity. Workers got their fair share. But then beginning in around 1980, that didn't happen. Compensation stagnated, even though productivity increased. That was a changing the rules of the game. That was the change in the structure of the economy, financialization and globalization. That is what has to be changed. Another problem is that there's more increase in the intergenerational transfer of advantage and disadvantage. And this is where education systems play a very important role in breaking that cycle. Good public education is absolutely essential, and it's failing in the United States. It's failing in other countries. It's important to try to look at that link more closely. And finally, the issue of redistribution, on which so much focus has traditionally been played. In a way, what I want to highlight just very briefly is the way that the tax bill that was passed in December of 2017 by the Republicans go exactly in the wrong way from what was needed in our society. Here, the United States is the most unequal society of all the advanced countries. And what did it do? When fully implemented, it raised the taxes on a majority of those in the middle, a majority of those in the second, third, and fourth quintiles. So to lower taxes on the billionaires and corporations. So we increased inequality. It will lead to 13 million more 13 million more Americans not having health insurance in a society in which life expectancy is in decline. So it was going in exactly the wrong way, and that's what happens when you have a politics that is a politics that's seized by the 1% for the 1%. That is a dynamic which is destroying, I think, the future. So what is needed is a comprehensive government policy to help transformation to a modern innovation, knowledge, service sector economy. And that involves active labor market policies. We'll be talking about more of that later. Social protection, industrial policies. A key part of the notion here is that the sectors that people care about and that are expanding, and rightly so, including health and education and caring for the aged, are sectors in which the government naturally, inherently, I would argue, plays an important role. But the straitjacket that governments have been placing on these government expenditures have undermined the ability of government to provide jobs in these areas. And these areas reflect societal values. If we care about our aged, if we care about our children, if we care about those who are sick, who are disabled, we will as a society decide to spend more on this. And that will lead wages. These are not just market phenomena. These reflect basic societal values. Underlying, I just want to reiterate, here is that there's been this major change in our understanding of inequality. And we now know that that equality and economic performance are complementary, and it related to the understandings of what gives rise to wealth of nations and the wealth of individuals. The true wealth of nations, as I say, is based on creation, on innovation, not on rent-seeking. But the wealth of many individuals is based on rent-seeking and exploitation of others. Countries like those in Scandinavia that have achieved greater equality have also performed better, especially if one uses the right metrics. And because they have achieved this shared prosperity, in these countries, there's greater support for openness and innovation, greater ability to bear risk, better job ensuring that individuals live up to their potential. When I talk to my friends in these countries, they explain why they went this direction. They said, we're small countries. We had to remain open. We had no choice. But they also were committed to democracy. And they said, if we are a democracy that is open, we have to make sure that all of our citizens benefit from openness and from innovation. And so they had no choice but to create a strong welfare state, a strong state that promoted education for all and the benefits for all. So now in the last few minutes, let me talk about a few of the implications for Korea. Policies that promote equality, knowledge, and innovation are most likely to succeed in enabling Korea to leapfrog and create a shared prosperity. What we've already seen is that Korea has leapfrogged. It went, as the president pointed out, from a country where the per capita income was lower than that of India, where the average education level was 4.3 years, 35 years ago, to a country that is among the wealthiest in the world with a per capita income of over $30,000. But it hasn't benefited, as everybody says, everybody in society. There's been too much reliance on trickle-down economics. But trickle-down economics, we know, doesn't work. So rather than rely on trickle-down economics, what one needs to do is build the economy up from the middle, create a strong middle class. And that, I take it, is what part of the agenda the current government is involved in. Rather than relying on markets, realize the critical role the government needs to play, working in concert with others, with civil society. So we need to get a better balance in our society between the market, the state, and the community. with a key role of democracy, with the systems of checks and balance. One cannot succeed in doing this without redistribution of wealth, because without that, politics won't work. It's the only real check against the abuse of power by the wealthy. We need a better balance between the different forms of organization. I believe there's an important role for cooperatives and nonprofits. The best universities in the United States are not-for-profit institutions. It's a little bit self-serving for me to say this, but universities like Princeton and Columbia are not for-profit institutions. Trump University was a for-profit institution. The only thing it knew how to do well was exploit other people. And that's true of most of the for-profit universities. We need a better balance between the present and the future, between humans and nature, remembering that the design of our social, political, and economic institutions shapes who we are. So what's at stake here is even the nature of who we are as people and the nature of our society. The market structure that we got over the last 40 years has not done this. So this is the right time for a new human-centered economic model, and I think Korea is the right place. And it gives me an enormous enthusiasm that there is this discussion under the current government about how to go about doing it. Because of its highly educated labor force, Korea is a good place to make a transition to a human-centered 21st century knowledge-learning economy. And while the overall share of college-educated adults is similar in Korea and USA, Korea's youth are much more likely to be educated. 69% of Korean adults 25 to 34 years of age have university of education, compared to only 49% in the United States. And if you look at standardized test scores like the PISA test scores, Koreans perform much better. And Korea is investing a lot more in research. So we have to look at different models of economic systems. And the sad reality is that the American model has failed. Though it has some areas of impressive strength, like higher education, where the universities I mentioned, the problems have been festering for 4 decades. So we now know that that system does not work. It's not just, it didn't work for a year or two. It's not just a small experiment. It's an experiment we've tried for 40 years, and it has failed. The political consequences, which I predicted, are now being evident. And I think it should be an important warning for others. So when I say that Korea should learn from others, it should learn from the failures of some and the successes of others. U.S. is an example, I think, of a failure with some successes. And the Scandinavian Nordic countries are countries which I think have more broadly succeeded. There is a need for a new social contract about shared prosperity. And I hope and I believe that Korea is charting an alternative path. It is, as I say, so energizing that while the United States is embarked in creating more inequality, Korea has recognized the state of its inequality, worried about this inequality, and is trying to create an alternative path. A path based on strengthening its highly educated middle class, creating an innovative and dynamic economy based on innovation, increasing wealth, and I think it has every prospect of creating a new shared prosperity. And I thank you for organizing this conference, from which I think all of us will learn about the path forward in creating this shared prosperity. Thank you very much.
네, 조지프 스티글리츠 교수님께서는 우리 사회가 불평등을 극복하고 더 나은 미래를 위해서 나가기 위해서는 지금까지의 경제 규칙이 아닌 완전히 새로운 경제 규칙이 필요하다는 말씀해 주셨습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.